They said he could walk through the woods without leaving a single footprint. They said dogs could not follow him, and men who chased him never returned the same. In the mountains of the South in 1843, fear began to move with a name they could not control. They called him the Ghost Walker. But he was no ghost. He was a man who refused to be captured again. Welcome to Shadows of Black History. If you are new to this channel, take a moment to subscribe and like our videos so you never miss the hidden stories that shaped the past. We truly appreciate every single one of you who watches and supports this journey into the forgotten corners of history. Tonight's story is one you will not want to miss even a single paragraph of. Stay with us until the very end, because this is a story of survival, strategy, and a man who turned fear into his greatest weapon. So relax, settle in, and let us begin. The mountains did not welcome strangers. In the southern ranges of 1843, the land rose sharply from the valleys, covered in thick forests that seemed to swallow light and sound. Narrow paths twisted through the trees, some leading somewhere, others leading nowhere at all. The ground shifted between firm soil and loose rock, making every step uncertain for those who did not know where to place their feet. It was a place where a man could disappear if he understood it well enough, and for those who did not, it was a place where fear could grow quickly. It was here that the story began, not with a legend, but with a man who had once been known by another name, a name taken from him the moment he was forced into bondage. No one agreed on what his real name had been. Some said it was Kofi, others claimed it was Daniel. But by the time his story began to spread, the name no longer mattered. What mattered was what he became. Before the mountains, before the whispers, he had been enslaved on a plantation at the edge of those very hills. He had worked the land, learned its patterns, watched the way the trees grew denser as they climbed, the way the air changed as elevation rose. He had listened to older men speak in quiet tones about escape, about the mountains beyond, about the risks and the possibilities. Most who tried did not return. Some were caught. Others simply vanished. But he listened. He remembered. And he waited. The moment came without warning, the way such moments always do. One night, under a sky thick with darkness, he left. There was no announcement, no farewell, no second attempt. He moved quickly, quietly, carrying nothing but what he could hold and what he had learned. The plantation faded behind him as he reached the base of the mountains, his breath steady, his mind focused on one thing: do not stop. The dogs were released before dawn. The riders followed soon after. The hunt began as it always did, with confidence, with certainty, with the belief that no one could outrun what was coming. But this time, something was different. He did not run blindly into the mountains. He entered them with purpose. Each step was chosen. Each path was deliberate. He avoided the obvious trails, moved along ridges where the ground held less scent, stepped in streams where water could carry his trace away. He understood that escape was not about speed alone. It was about confusion. It was about breaking patterns. The dogs followed at first, their voices sharp in the distance, growing closer, then strangely fading, then returning again as the terrain twisted their sense of direction. The hunters pushed forward, confident in their experience, but the land did not respond to them the way it responded to him. Days passed, then more. The chase did not end in capture. It ended in something the hunters did not expect. Silence. The trail disappeared. The dogs lost the scent completely. The riders searched the ridges, the valleys, the streams, but there was nothing. No clear sign, no direction. It was as if he had stepped into the mountain and been taken by it. They returned with nothing, their certainty shaken, their confidence unsettled. And in that absence, something began to grow. At first, it was just a story, a man who escaped and could not be found. But stories do not remain small when fear feeds them. Weeks later, a trader traveling through a narrow pass claimed he saw a figure watching from the trees, standing still, then gone in an instant. A patrol reported hearing footsteps that did not match their own, moving beside them, but never visible. A hunter swore that his dog followed a trail that circled back on itself, leading nowhere, as if something had deliberately misled it. The stories began to connect, not through proof, but through pattern, a presence, a movement. Something in the mountains that did not behave like a man being hunted. They began to call him something else, Ghost Walker. Not because they believed he was not human, but because they could not track him like one. He moved without leaving signs. He appeared without warning. He vanished without trace. And the more they spoke of him, the more real he became. Not just as a man, but as something that could not be controlled. But he was real, and he was watching. The mountains did not simply hide him, they reshaped him. What began as escape slowly became something far more deliberate, far more controlled, and far more dangerous for those who entered his territory without understanding it. In the early days, he moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be found. He followed the ridgelines, drank from narrow streams, and rested in places where visibility stretched far beyond what anyone below could imagine, but survival alone was not enough. He knew that if he remained only a man running, eventually someone would learn enough to catch him. So he changed the terms of the chase. He stopped thinking like prey. He began to think like the land itself. He studied everything. The way sound carried through the valleys at different times of day. The way animals reacted to movement, often revealing the presence of others long before a human could see them. The way wind shifted direction as it moved through narrow passes, carrying scent in unpredictable ways. He learned where the ground held firm and where it broke under pressure. He learned which plants could be eaten, which could be used for medicine, and which could mask scent when crushed beneath his hands. This was not instinct alone. It was discipline. Every movement had a purpose. Every decision was made with awareness. And slowly, the mountains stopped being a place he passed through. They became a place he controlled. The first time he turned back toward the hunters was not out of anger. It was calculation. A small group had entered the lower slopes, following what they believed to be a fresh trail. They moved with confidence, their voices low but certain, their dogs alert and eager. He watched them from above, hidden among the trees, his body still, his breathing slow. He did not reveal himself. He did not rush. Instead, he moved ahead of them, circling through terrain they did not know, placing signs where he wanted them to look. A broken branch here, a footprint pressed deeper than necessary there, enough to guide them, but not enough to reveal the truth. They followed. Of course they did. That was what they were trained to do. Hours later, they realized something was wrong. The trail did not lead downward as expected. It led upward, into steeper ground where movement became slower, where footing became uncertain. The dogs began to hesitate, their noses lifting, their behavior shifting from confidence to confusion. One of the men stopped, looking around, trying to understand what had changed. But by then, it was too late. The path they had followed had not been a mistake. It had been placed, and they had walked directly into it. He did not attack. Not yet. That was not the lesson he wanted to teach. Instead, he let the mountain do what it did best. As they attempted to retrace their steps, they found the ground had changed. What had seemed like a clear path now appeared different. The markers they had followed no longer aligned. The forest, which had seemed passive before, now felt disorienting. Every direction looked similar. Every turn led to uncertainty. By the time they made their way back down, exhausted and unsettled, the trail was gone. Completely. As if it had never existed. They returned with more than failure. They returned with doubt. And doubt spreads faster than fear. The stories grew stronger after that, no longer just whispers of a man who could not be caught, but accounts of something that could mislead, confuse, and control movement itself. Some claimed he could mimic sounds, leading dogs in the wrong direction. Others said he walked in places where no human could, along narrow edges and steep drops that would send others falling. A few insisted that he watched them from a distance, always just beyond sight, always aware of where they were before they even knew it themselves. The name Ghost Walker began to carry weight, not as a rumor, but as a warning. For the plantation owners and hunters, this was unacceptable. A man who escaped was one thing. A man who could not be found was another. But a man who began to influence the behavior of those sent to capture him, that was something else entirely. It challenged authority. It disrupted control. And control, once questioned, becomes fragile. So they sent more men, better trackers, more experienced hunters. They believed that with enough skill, enough force, enough persistence, they could solve the problem. But they were still thinking in the wrong direction. He did not fight them as they expected. He did not meet them in open confrontation. He did not rely on strength alone. He relied on time, on patience, on understanding that fear, once introduced, changes how people move, how they think, how they react. He allowed them to enter deeper, to push further than they should have, to believe they were getting closer. Then he removed certainty, one step at a time. A group of 3 hunters once followed a trail for nearly a full day, convinced they were close. The signs were clear, too clear. They did not notice how consistent they were, how perfectly spaced, how deliberately placed. By the time they realized they had been walking in a circle, the sun had already begun to set. The forest around them grew darker, the sounds unfamiliar, the direction unclear. They spent the night in uncertainty, their fire small, their voices quieter than before. And in the distance, just beyond the edge of light, something moved. They never saw him clearly, but they felt him. That was enough. By the time they returned, they did not speak of what had happened in detail. They did not need to. It showed in how they carried themselves, in how they looked at the mountains, in how they hesitated before stepping back into that terrain again. The Ghost Walker was no longer just a man who had escaped. He had become something that influenced behavior, something that altered decisions, something that lived in the space between what could be seen and what could not be understood. And through all of it, he remained what he had always been, a man. But a man who had taken everything meant to confine him, everything meant to control him, and turned it into something the system could not fully grasp. He was no longer running. He was shaping the hunt. There comes a moment in every hunt when the balance shifts so completely that it can no longer be called a hunt at all. It becomes something else. In the mountains of 1843, that moment arrived not with noise, but with silence. The kind of silence that makes men stop walking, turn their heads, and realize they are no longer the ones in control. By then, the Ghost Walker had already studied enough, moved enough, learned enough. He no longer needed to prove he could escape. That had already been done. Now he began to show something far more dangerous. He could reach back. It started small, almost unnoticed at first. A supply sack left behind by a group of hunters was found missing the next morning. Not stolen completely, but altered. Food gone, water untouched. A rope cut cleanly. Not frayed, not broken. Deliberate. A message without words. Another group reported hearing movement near their camp at night. Footsteps circling just beyond the reach of firelight. They rushed out, weapons ready, but found nothing. No tracks. No direction. Just the lingering sense that they had been watched while they slept. These moments were not attacks. They were signals. Carefully placed reminders that the distance between hunter and hunted had collapsed. Then came the first direct strike. A lone tracker had separated slightly from his group, following what he believed was a clear sign of movement. He moved quietly, carefully, confident in his skill. He had done this before. He trusted his ability to read the land, but the land he was reading was no longer neutral. It had been shaped, guided. As he moved deeper, the forest grew quieter. The usual sounds faded, replaced by a stillness that pressed against his senses. He slowed, his instincts beginning to question what his eyes believed. Then he stopped completely. He felt it. Not a sound, not a movement, a presence. He turned slowly, scanning the trees, the ground, the shadows that seemed to stretch further than they should. For a moment there was nothing. Then, just beyond his direct line of sight, something shifted. Not enough to see clearly, just enough to know he was not alone. He called out. No answer. He took a step back. Another movement, this time closer. Then silence again. The moment stretched, long enough for fear to take shape, long enough for certainty to disappear. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The presence was gone. No sound. No direction. Nothing to follow. When the tracker returned to his group, he spoke little, but he did not need to explain. They saw it in his face. Something had changed. The Ghost Walker was no longer avoiding them. He was choosing when to appear. That realization spread quickly, and with it came a different kind of fear. Not the fear of not finding him, but the fear of being found by him. The hunters began to move differently, slower, more cautious. They stayed closer together, spoke less, listened more. But even that adjustment could not restore what had been lost, because the problem was no longer just the terrain. It was the mind. Once fear enters the mind, it does not leave easily. It reshapes how every sound is interpreted, how every shadow is seen, how every decision is made. The Ghost Walker understood this better than they did. He did not waste energy on unnecessary confrontation. Every action had purpose. Every appearance had timing. He struck only when it mattered, and even then, not always with force. Sometimes the impact of being seen, of being near, of disrupting the certainty of those who hunted him, was enough. It created hesitation, and hesitation in a place like the mountains could be more dangerous than any direct attack. But there were moments when action became necessary. One evening, as a group of hunters made camp along a narrow ridge, believing they had chosen a defensible position, he watched from above. He observed their setup, their spacing, their patterns. He noted where their attention focused, where it weakened. And when the time came, he moved. Not through the center, not where they expected, but along the edge, where the terrain dropped sharply, where movement required precision. He stepped where others would not, moved where others could not, and reached the point where their control was weakest. The disruption was quick. A sudden noise from one side drew attention. A shift of movement from another divided it further. Before they could regroup, before they could fully understand what was happening, The balance had already been broken. Supplies were scattered. A weapon displaced. A sense of order replaced by confusion. And then, just as quickly, he was gone. No clear direction. No visible path. Only the realization that he had been there. That was enough. The hunters did not pursue immediately. For the first time, they hesitated. Not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked certainty. They no longer knew how to approach the situation. Every step forward now carried a question. Was it leading closer or deeper into something they did not understand? And that question slowed them more than any obstacle the land could provide. The stories that returned from these encounters changed in tone. They were no longer just accounts of difficulty or frustration. They carried something else. Respect, though it was not always spoken as such. An acknowledgement that the man they were hunting had become something they could not easily define. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but something just as difficult to confront. A man who had taken control of the space around him. A man who had turned survival into strategy. A man who no longer reacted to the hunt, but shaped it. And in the mountains of the south, where the land already belonged to those who understood it best, that kind of control was something no amount of force could easily overcome. The Ghost Walker had crossed a line. He was no longer escaping. He was deciding. By the time the decision was made, the hunt had already taken on a life of its own. It was no longer about retrieving a single escaped man. It had become something far more dangerous to those in power. A challenge, a disruption, a story that refused to stay contained. Plantation owners spoke in tighter circles now, their voices lower, their concern harder to hide. The name Ghost Walker had begun to travel beyond the mountains, carried by traders, patrolmen, and those who had seen enough to know that something was not right. Fear, once directed downward, had begun to shift, and that could not be allowed to continue. So they organized something different, not scattered groups, not individual trackers, a coordinated effort, larger, more controlled, more force than had been used before. They chose their men carefully. Experienced trackers, hunters who had spent years moving through difficult terrain, men who believed they could not be outmatched by land or by any man within it. They were given clear instructions. Move together. Do not separate. Do not follow trails without confirmation. Maintain communication. It was the kind of structure designed to remove uncertainty, to bring order back into a situation that had slipped beyond control. They believed that by tightening their approach, by removing the gaps the Ghost Walker had used so effectively, they could finally corner him. They entered the mountains not with the loose confidence of earlier hunts, but with focused intent. The Ghost Walker knew they were coming before they reached the higher ridges. He had seen the signs long before the men themselves appeared. The way movement increased along the lower paths. The way the air carried different sounds, heavier, more consistent. The presence of a group large enough to disturb the natural rhythm of the land. He watched from above, from a position where the forest opened just enough to reveal movement without exposing his own. He counted them, studied their formation, noted their spacing, their communication, the way they paused and moved as one unit. This was different. This was not a group he could mislead with simple patterns or scattered signs. This was something organized, so he adjusted. He did not rush to confront them. He did not repeat what had worked before. He changed the terms again. Instead of guiding them into confusion immediately, he allowed them to move, to advance, to believe their structure was working. He gave them just enough of what they expected to reinforce their confidence. A faint sign here, a broken branch there. Nothing too clear, nothing too deliberate. Just enough to keep them moving forward, deeper into the mountains where the terrain would begin to shift in his favor. Hours turned into a full day of movement. The hunters maintained their formation, their discipline holding as they navigated the rising ground. They spoke less, listened more, watched each other as much as they watched the land. They believed they were closing in, that the absence of confusion meant they were doing something right. And in a way, they were. They had removed some of the weaknesses that had cost others before them. But they had not removed the one factor they could not control: him. By the second day, the terrain began to change. The paths narrowed. The ground grew less stable. Large stones replaced soft soil. The trees thickened in some areas, then opened suddenly in others, creating gaps where visibility stretched further than expected. It was the kind of land that required more than skill. It required familiarity. The hunters slowed, not from fear, but from necessity. Their formation tightened. Their communication became more frequent. They were adapting. But adaptation takes time, and time, in the mountains, is something that can be used against you. The Ghost Walker moved ahead of them, not just watching, but shaping. He knew where the land would begin to break their structure, where the paths would force them into tighter lines, where their ability to move as one would be tested. He did not need to create confusion immediately. The land would do that for him if he guided them correctly. The moment came at a narrow pass that cut between two steep rises. The ground there was uneven, sloping slightly to one side, with loose rock that shifted under weight. It was not impossible to cross, but it required careful movement. The hunters approached it with caution, their leader signaling for a slower pace. One by one, they began to pass through, maintaining their formation as best they could. That was when the shift began. Not with a loud noise, not with a sudden attack, but with a small change. A stone displaced at the right moment, a sound from above that drew attention just enough to break focus, a movement to the edge of sight that caused one man to pause, then another. It was subtle, controlled. But in terrain like that, subtle is enough. The formation broke. Not completely, not at once, but enough. And that was all he needed. He moved along the higher edge of the pass, where the ground held firm and the angle gave him visibility without exposure. He did not rush. He did not reveal himself fully. He created pressure, movement where there should be none, sound where there should be silence. The hunters reacted, turning, adjusting, trying to re-establish their structure. But the terrain worked against them now. The narrow space limited their ability to regroup. The uneven ground forced them to focus on footing as much as direction. Then he appeared. Not for long. Just enough. A figure moving across the ridge above them. Clear for a second. Then gone. It was the first time many of them had seen him. And it changed everything. Because now he was no longer just a story, not just a presence. He was real. And he was above them. The reaction was immediate. Some raised their weapons. Others called out. A few tried to move faster through the pass, creating more instability, more noise, more disruption. The leader shouted orders, trying to regain control. But control requires time. And time was something they no longer had. The Ghost Walker did not stay. He did not need to. The moment had already done what it was meant to do. He had shown himself, on his terms, in his space, and then he was gone again, leaving behind a group of men who now understood something they had not fully accepted before. They were not hunting him. They had entered his territory, and he was deciding what happened next. The final effort had not failed in the way the others had. It had done something worse. It had confirmed that even with structure, with discipline, with numbers, They could not control the outcome, because control did not belong to them anymore. The retreat did not begin as an order. It began as a feeling that moved quietly through the group, settling into each man before it was ever spoken aloud. They had entered the mountains with structure, with discipline, with the belief that organization would bring control back into their hands. But as they moved away from the narrow pass, something had already shifted too deeply to be reversed. Their steps were slower now, not from exhaustion alone, but from awareness. Every sound carried meaning. Every movement was measured against the possibility that it might not be their own. They were no longer advancing. They were withdrawing, even if no one had yet said the word. The leader eventually gave the command, his voice steady but carrying a weight that had not been there before. They would pull back, regroup, reassess. It was spoken as strategy, not defeat. But those who heard it understood the difference. This was not a temporary adjustment. This was an acknowledgement, quiet but undeniable, that the situation had moved beyond their control. They began to descend the mountain paths in formation, but the formation no longer carried the same confidence. It was tighter now, more cautious, as if the space around them could no longer be trusted. Above them, unseen, the Ghost Walker watched. He did not follow closely. He did not press the advantage in the way a conventional hunter might. He allowed distance to remain. He allowed them to leave. Because the purpose had never been to destroy them completely. It had been to change them, to show them something they could not ignore. And that had already been done. As they moved lower, the terrain began to ease, the ground more familiar, the trees less dense. The air itself seemed lighter, but the feeling did not lift with it. What they carried now was not something that could be left behind with the mountain. When they reached the edge of the range, they did not speak immediately. They paused, some looking back, others keeping their eyes forward, as if turning around might reveal something they were not prepared to face again. The leader gave final instructions, short and direct, then dismissed them. The hunt was over. Not concluded. Not resolved. Over. And that distinction mattered. The story of what had happened did not return in a single form. It spread in pieces, carried by different voices, shaped by different perspectives. Some spoke of a man who could not be tracked, who moved through the mountains as if he were part of them. Others described something more unsettling, a presence that appeared when it chose, that influenced movement without being seen, that turned experienced hunters into uncertain men. The details varied, but the core remained consistent. They had gone in with control. They had come out without it. The name Ghost Walker began to travel further than before. It reached plantations that had never seen the mountains. It reached towns where the land was flat and open, where the idea of someone controlling an entire region through movement alone felt impossible. But stories do not need belief to spread. They need repetition. And this story carried something stronger than rumor. It carried impact. The kind that changes how people think, how they move, how they act. For the enslaved, the story carried a different meaning. It was not just about fear. It was about possibility. A man who had escaped. A man who had not been caught. A man who had turned the system meant to control him into something that could not reach him. The details did not need to be exact. The idea was enough. That someone could move beyond the reach of power, not just for a moment, but for as long as he chose. For the hunters and those who sent them, the story carried a warning. Not all terrain could be controlled. Not all men could be broken. And not all situations could be resolved through force. It did not stop the system. It did not end the hunts entirely. But it changed how they were approached. More caution, more hesitation, more awareness that there were limits to what could be done. And in the mountains, the Ghost Walker remained. He did not seek to expand the story. He did not move beyond the land that had shaped him. He continued as he had learned to be, observing, moving, adapting. The mountains were not just his refuge. They were his domain. Every path, every ridge, every shift in the air belonged to a system he understood completely. And within that system, he existed on his own terms. He was no longer the man who had run into the mountains with nothing. He was the man who had become something the mountains themselves protected. And that was something no one could take from him. The story did not stay in the mountains. It moved outward the way wind moves through trees, unseen, but unmistakable in its effect. By the time it reached the edges of towns and distant plantations, it had already taken on a life that no one could fully control. Some told it as a warning, others as a mystery, and many as something they could not quite explain, but could not ignore either. The Ghost Walker was no longer just a man who had escaped into the mountains in 1843. He had become a presence in conversation, in caution, in the way people thought about the limits of control. And once a story reaches that point, it does not fade easily. Among enslaved communities, the story carried quiet strength. It was shared carefully, often in low voices at night, when the day's watchful eyes had softened and the world felt just open enough for truth to pass between people. The details were not always the same, but the meaning never changed. A man had escaped. He had not been taken back. He had faced those sent to capture him, and had not only survived, but changed the way they moved. That idea settled into the minds of those who heard it, not as a call to reckless action, but as something deeper. A reminder that the system, no matter how powerful, was not without limits. That understanding alone was enough to shift something inside. For those who held power, the story created a different kind of pressure. It was not just about one man in the mountains anymore. It was about what he represented, the idea that someone could exist beyond reach, beyond control and influence. The behavior of those meant to enforce that control was something that could not be easily dismissed. They spoke of him in more practical terms when they could, reducing the story to exaggeration, to rumor, to something that could be explained away. But even in those efforts, there was an edge of caution that had not been there before. Hunters who had once moved with certainty now asked more questions before entering unfamiliar terrain. Patrols were more deliberate, less willing to push into areas they did not fully understand. The mountains, once seen as an obstacle, began to be seen as something else entirely. Over time, the Ghost Walker's presence began to shape decisions in ways that were not always obvious. Routes that once passed near the mountain edges were adjusted. Certain areas were avoided altogether, not because they were officially marked as dangerous, but because enough had happened there to create hesitation. That hesitation mattered. It changed how far control extended. It created spaces, small at first, where the system did not reach as strongly as before. And in those spaces, even if nothing visible changed immediately, the possibility of something different began to exist. The man himself did not seek to become what the stories made him. He remained within the mountains, moving as he always had, guided by the same awareness that had allowed him to survive from the beginning. He did not step into towns. He did not reveal himself beyond what was necessary. His existence was not built on being seen. It was built on being understood, without needing to be visible. The land remained his ally, and he remained part of it. The rhythms of the forest, the shifts in weather, the patterns of movement, all of it continued to guide him. He adapted as needed, changed his paths when necessary, and maintained the balance that had kept him beyond reach. There were moments when others came close to understanding him more clearly. A traveler might catch a glimpse of movement along a distant ridge, A hunter might find signs that suggested deliberate placement rather than chance. A group passing through might feel watched without ever confirming it. These moments did not lead to capture. They led to reinforcement of the story. Each encounter added another layer, another piece, another reason for the name Ghost Walker to carry the weight it did. Years passed, and the world beyond the mountains continued to change in ways both large and small. But the story did not fade with time. It adapted, just as he had. It remained relevant because it was not tied to a single moment, but to a way of understanding the world. That control is not absolute. That knowledge can shift power. That patience and awareness can create outcomes that force cannot. These ideas traveled far beyond the original events, shaping how people thought, even if they did not always connect it directly to the man in the mountains. For some, the Ghost Walker became a symbol, not of fear alone, but of resistance shaped by intelligence rather than impulse, of survival that evolves into control, of a man who refused to remain within the boundaries set for him, and instead created his own. That symbol mattered, not because it changed everything at once, but because it changed something in how people viewed what was possible. And in the mountains, where the story had begun, nothing needed to be said for it to remain real. The land held its memory. The paths still twisted the same way. The ridges still offered the same view. And somewhere within that space, unseen but present, the man who had once been hunted continued to exist on his own terms. Part 7 will bring the final reflection on the Ghost Walker's legacy and how one man's escape became a lasting force that no system could fully erase. Part 7. Time did not erase the Ghost Walker. It refined him, the way wind shapes stone over years, not by force, but by persistence. Long after the first hunters had turned back, long after the stories had begun to spread beyond the mountains, his presence remained where it had always been, rooted in the land that had both tested and transformed him. The forest still stood thick and watchful, the ridges still cut through the sky with quiet strength, and the narrow paths still twisted in ways only a few could understand. But what had changed was not the land itself. It was what the land now represented. It had become a boundary not easily crossed, a place where control weakened and awareness mattered more than authority. And at the center of that understanding was a man who had refused to be taken back. Those who came after him felt that shift, even if they never saw him directly. Hunters approached the mountains differently, no longer with the same confidence that had once defined their movements. They spoke less loudly, moved more cautiously, and questioned their own certainty in ways they had not before. The idea of the Ghost Walker had settled into their thinking, shaping decisions before they were even made. Some tried to dismiss it, to reduce it to exaggeration or fear, but dismissal did not remove its influence. It lingered in the pauses before action, in the hesitation before stepping into unfamiliar ground, in the awareness that there were forces at work they did not fully understand. For those who lived under the weight of control, the legacy carried a different kind of power. It was not about the details of what he had done, or how he had done it. Those things mattered less over time. What remained was the truth that someone had stepped beyond the reach of the system and had not been pulled back. That truth moved quietly, passed from one person to another in ways that could not be traced, shaping thought without needing to be declared. It did not create sudden change. It did not break the structure all at once, but it planted something steady, a belief that boundaries could be crossed, that control could be challenged, that survival could become something more. The Ghost Walker himself did not become a figure who stepped forward to claim recognition. He did not leave the mountains to prove his existence. He did not need to. The land continued to speak for him in the only way that mattered, through absence, through the inability of others to define or contain him, through the continued failure of those who tried to bring him back into a system he had already left behind. His life was not built on being seen. It was built on remaining beyond reach, and that, in itself, became the strongest statement he could make. There were those who claimed to have seen him years later, a figure moving along a distant ridge at dusk, a shadow that paused just long enough to be recognized before disappearing into the trees. Others spoke of signs, small and deliberate, that appeared in places where no one else could have moved so quietly. These accounts were never confirmed, never proven, but they did not need to be. The story had moved beyond proof. It had become part of how people understood that space, that time, that possibility. As the years passed and the world continued to change, the Ghost Walker remained what he had always been at his core. Not a spirit, not a myth. A man. A man who had taken knowledge, patience, and awareness and turned them into something stronger than force. A man who had refused to accept the limits placed on him and instead redefined them in a way that others were forced to recognize, even if they did not speak it aloud. And in that quiet, lasting way, his story endured. Not written in official records, not carried in the language of those who held power, but living where it mattered most, in memory, in understanding, in the knowledge that even in a world built to control every step, there are those who learn how to walk beyond it. Thank you for watching Shadows of Black History. If this story moved you, remember to subscribe and like the channel so more hidden stories from the past can be told. And always remember, history is not only shaped by those who held power, it is carried by those who found a way to move beyond it, even when the world believed it was impossible.